Welcome to today's deep dive. And we're really tackling a pretty crucial question today. Can Nepal handle its growing debt? Yeah, you might be thinking, Nepal, isn't that the Himalayan nation with all the stunning landscapes and the rich culture? You'd be absolutely right. But there's a lot happening beneath the surface, economically speaking, that is. So we've got two key documents to kind of guide us through this. A bulletin from Nepal's Public Debt Management Office, PDMO for short, and then a joint report from the International Monetary Fund and the International Development Association, IMF and IDA, respectively.
It's always interesting to see how different sources frame the same issue, right? Especially when we're talking about something as complex as, national debt.
Absolutely. Now, the PDMO, they paint a pretty optimistic picture. They're highlighting that Nepal has the lowest debt-to-GDP ratio in the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, STARC region. Now, that's a group of 8 South Asian nations, including Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. So within that group, Nepal's ratio is the lowest, at 42.7% as of June 2023. They're also, quick to point out that they have a good track record of repayment, even during some tough times, like the 2015 earthquake and the COVID-19 pandemic. But then we have the IMF and IDA report, and they take a bit of a different stance.
Yeah, they do. They acknowledge that seemingly low debt-to-GDP ratio. But they really emphasize the fact that Nepal's debt has nearly doubled since 2016. Reaching 47% of GDP in 2023, and it's projected to hit 50% by 2026. And that's where I think the alarm bells start ringing.
Yeah, so even though the current debt-to-GDP ratio might seem manageable, the rate at which it's increasing, that's concerning. And the IMF and IDA point to a key factor here, Nepal's economic growth. It hasn't kept pace with this rapid debt accumulation.
It's like, think of it like filling a bathtub with the drain partially open. Even if the water level seemed okay for now, if you keep pouring water in faster than it can drain out, eventually you're going to have a flood. And in Nepal's case, the water is the debt, and the drain is their economic growth. And the report's suggesting that the drain isn't wide enough to handle that current inflow.
I like that. That's a great analogy. So We're seeing this discrepancy, right, between this snapshot view presented by the PDMO and then a more dynamic, trend-focused assessment from the IMF and IDA. And the latter seems particularly worried about the sustainability of Nepal's debt, especially in light of its relatively slow economic growth.
Yeah, the IMF and IDA, they're particularly concerned about this rapid rise in debt because of what it could do to the government's budget. As that debt grows, so do those interest payments, and that can squeeze out, other essential spending on things like education, healthcare, infrastructure, all those things that are so crucial for driving long-term economic growth and just improving people's lives.
And it's interesting because the PDMO highlights their success in securing concessional loans from these international lenders, meaning, loans with very favorable terms, low interest rates, long repayment periods. But here's where it gets a bit paradoxical. The IMF and IDA report points out that despite access to these cheaper external loans, Nepal has increasingly relied on domestic borrowing in recent years, which tends to be much more expensive.
Right, and this over-reliance on domestic borrowing, even though they have access to these cheaper external loans, that's a major red flag for the IMF and IDA. They suggest it points to these, deeper structural problems within Nepal's economy.
So it's not just about having access to the funds, right?
Yeah.
But about effectively using them. So what's preventing Nepal from tapping into these more favorable external loans?
Well, the report highlights political and capacity constraints as major roadblocks. Nepal faces these bureaucratic hurdles, lack of skilled personnel in these key government agencies, and often delays in things like land acquisition and environmental clearances. All of these things can stall these externally funded projects, and that forces the government to turn to domestic borrowing to bridge the gap, even though it comes at a higher cost.
So it sounds like they're stuck in a bit of a vicious cycle here. They need the external funds to implement the projects that would boost their economy, which would ultimately help them manage their debt. But they're facing all these obstacles and actually utilizing those funds effectively.
Exactly. And this reliance on more expensive domestic borrowing just further exacerbates the problem. It increases that overall debt burden and puts more pressure on the government's budget. The IMF and IDA report also points out another concerning detail. A significant chunk of this domestic debt, almost a third, is in the form of short-term treasury bills.
Oh, wow. So they're essentially taking on short-term debt to finance these long-term development projects. Doesn't that create refinancing risks down the line?
Absolutely. These treasury bills mature quickly, often within a year, and need to be rolled over, meaning the government has to issue new debt to pay off the old if interest rates rise. As projected, this refinancing becomes increasingly expensive. further straining the budget.
And the IMF and IDA do anticipate rising interest rates in the medium term, which adds another layer of concern to this already precarious situation. So what happens if those interest payments start consuming a larger and larger chunk of the government's budget?
Well, it can lead to a situation where the government has less money available to invest in these critical areas, like education, healthcare, infrastructure, and this can hinder that long-term economic growth, making it even harder for Nepal to manage its debt burden. It's a dangerous spiral.
So on top of the rapidly rising debt itself, we have these underlying structural issues, a reliance on expensive short-term borrowing, and the looming prospect of rising interest rates, all converging to create a very challenging situation for Nepal.
Yes, and the IMF and IDA report stresses that all these factors combined make Nepal's economy highly vulnerable to shocks.
So what kinds of shocks are we talking about here?
Well, it could be anything from, global economic downturn to a natural disaster, a sudden drop in those remittances we talked about earlier, or political instability. Any of these events could disrupt Nepal's fragile economic balance and potentially push them towards a debt crisis.
It's almost like they're walking a tightrope with all these potential hazards lurking below. So what can they do to build greater resilience and mitigate these risks?
The IMF and IDA report suggests a multifaceted approach. First and foremost, they urge Nepal to, really double down on efforts to boost economic growth.
So back to tackling those bureaucratic hurdles, improving governance, and investing in building capacity within those key government agencies.
Exactly. They need to create a more efficient and transparent system that can effectively implement these development projects, especially those funded by those external loans. This would allow them to better utilize those cheaper funds and reduce their reliance on the more expensive domestic borrowing.
But boosting economic growth isn't a quick fix, is it? So what about some more immediate measures to address the rising debt burden?
Well, the IMF and IDA also recommend implementing a medium-term debt strategy. This involves setting clear borrowing limits, prioritizing spending on projects that have the highest potential for economic returns, and exploring options for debt restructuring or refinancing to try and secure more favorable terms.
So it's about taking a more strategic and proactive approach to managing debt, rather than just reacting to crises as they arise.
Precisely. The IMF and IDA also emphasize the importance of fiscal consolidation, which essentially means bringing government spending more in line with revenue. This can involve some tough choices, like cutting back on non-essential expenditures, improving tax collection efficiency, and exploring new revenue streams.
And the PDMO does mention some steps they're taking in this direction, right? Like implementing new regulations to improve debt management practices. But it sounds like the IMF and IDA are calling for a more comprehensive and perhaps even bolder approach.
Yeah, and they also stress the importance of diversifying Nepal's economy. Currently, they're heavily reliant on remittances, which, as we discussed, are projected to decline as a percentage of GDP over time.
So they need to reduce their reliance on this single source of income and create a more balanced,
resilient
economic structure.
Exactly. Boosting exports is crucial. And they have a real opportunity in the hydropower sector. Nepal has this vast untapped hydropower potential, and exporting this clean energy to neighboring countries like India could generate some significant revenue and create jobs.
So it's about capitalizing on their unique strengths and finding those niches where they can really excel in the global market.
Right. They also need to create a more favorable environment for private sector investment, which can play a key role in driving that economic growth and diversification. This means reducing that bureaucratic red tape, streamlining regulations, and fostering a more stable and predictable business climate.
So it sounds like Nepal faces a complex set of challenges.
Yeah.
But also has the potential to turn things around with the right policies and a commitment to long-term sustainable development.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that economic development is not just about numbers. It's about people, their livelihoods, and their aspirations for a brighter future.
And it really underscores the importance of responsible governance, strategic planning, and a willingness to make those tough choices to secure a more stable and prosperous future. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Nepal's debt dilemma, we'll leave you with this thought. Nepal's journey is a testament to that delicate balance between opportunity and risk in a rapidly changing world. What do you think? Will Nepal be able to navigate these complex challenges and secure a more sustainable future? Thanks for joining us. We hope this deep dive provided some valuable insights and sparked your curiosity to learn more.